With the low carb meal, 44 minutes, 24 seconds, and then 43 minutes and 30 seconds with high carb. So that's nearly a minute. That's 56 seconds faster with the high carb meal. Okay, any runner is going to be happy with a 1 minute difference.
G'day and welcome to Fuel In Sessions, the podcast that delves into the science of nutrition. Fuel In Sessions is powered by Fuel In, the AI nutrition app that makes nutrition simple, personalized, and adaptive for all athletes. We're here to share expert insights, training tips, strategies, and of course, some laughs so you can fuel your best and reach your peak health and performance. My name's Scott Tyndall. I'm your host and Chief Nutrition Officer for Fuel In. Today, I'm joined by Brady Holmer, who is an exercise physiologist and writes a fairly substantial and incredible, do we call it a blog, Brady? Would you say we'd call it a blog?
A newsletter.
A newsletter. Blog's probably unfair or unkind to the amount of effort and detail that you go in. But Brady, welcome back to the show. I think last time I had you on, I didn't actually give you a good opportunity to explain who you were. So do you want to just give a very quick intro who you are and what you're doing?
Sure. Before I say that, thanks for having me back on to discuss some fun studies that I think we've been throwing back and forth. Always fun to chat this stuff with you, Scott. So, yeah, I am an exercise scientist, more so in the kind of writing and researching world versus the sort of applied physiology world these days. But I have a master's degree in human performance, bachelor's degree in exercise science. So I have a decent amount of training in physiology research and cardiovascular research during graduate school. But now I spend most of my time reading science, writing about science, trying to translate it for athletes, just the general public to better understand it. And in my full-time, that's kind of my part-time job is writing this newsletter. My full-time job, I actually work for Dr. Rhonda Patrick. I help read and research science for her as well, helping with podcast content, researching guests, all kinds of stuff there. So sort of her scientific assistant, her research assistant in a way, helping to break down a bunch of the science in the nutrition longevity world and what's going on there. So I kind of have my hats in multiple different arenas, but broadly just, health science, nutrition science, performance science, all things I'm interested in. I'm a marathon runner, endurance runner as well. So I have kind of also a vested interest in this. A lot of the stuff that I read, I try to apply and experiment on myself.
Yeah, I think, a couple of big things there. Obviously, Dr. Rhonda Patrick is well known, pretty heavy hitter, I guess, in terms of podcasts and the whatnot. I know I first listened to her and saw her work, I think, with Tim Ferriss actually a long time ago, and she's since been on sort of Andrew Huberman's podcast and the whatnot. So, I think it's a credit to you to help her in sort of delving through all the research and trying to unpack what's fact and what's fiction. So that's great. And I think you're pretty humble in saying you're a marathon runner. I think you ran a 2:23, I believe. Is that right? 2:23, 2:24?
2:24 at Boston, yep.
Yeah, that's not just a marathon runner, mate.
Hoping to improve upon that this fall by a few minutes.
I dream of those days. Did you? You obviously would have put your application in for Boston, I imagine, this week.
I actually didn't because I don't plan on running it next year. So I ran it for the first time this year, set a personal record, and then I think we'll wait another year or two before I decide to go back and run it. I have a few other races on my schedule for next year.
Well, hopefully you're going to come down to Sydney and run it as a major. There were some pretty fast times for the pros and the elites. I'd expect you to be flying down some of those hills and maybe getting another PR.
Yeah, hopefully someday. I'd love to come out there and run it. I don't have any, I guess Boston, but other than that, no marathon majors. But yeah, Sydney looked quick, so hopefully if I can get under that 2:20 range, maybe somebody will pay me to come out and run it.
Love it. Well, you're always welcome to come and stay with me, mate. So.
Awesome.
Right. Well, let's get into this. So the paper is Substrate Oxidation Does Not Influence Middle Distance Running Performance, a randomized controlled crossover trial. The authors, there was plenty of them. Buga, is that how I pronounce it? Or Bugger? Buga et al. 2025. So you sent me this paper and said, let's cover this one. Do you want to kick it off and give a little insight or an oversight as to what the study was looking at and who the authors were as well?
Yeah, so the authors, including who you mentioned, Philip Prinz, Jeff Volek was on there, Andrew Kutnick, also kind of a prominent researcher. All these guys were on it, and again, we were just chatting offline about this group, and they have a lot of previous publications investigating some of these low carb versus high carb for performance, and I would tend to say that they tend to be biased towards the low carb, and maybe not saying that in a negative way. I just mean, biased. They tend to lean heavily into, being a kind of low carb group and seeing can low carb benefit performance. Volek is pretty well known in the low carb and keto world for investigating kind of low carb nutrition. I think he wrote a book on the topic of low carb nutrition for performance. So this group, in the last couple of years, they've published a few studies, and this was their most recent one. And the idea was to, as you mentioned, the title kind of says it all, but does substrate oxidation influence time trial performance? And so this was an acute study, as opposed to some of their other studies where they'll do a keto low carb diet for 1 to 4 weeks or something like that to allow a little bit of adaptation. This one was acute, and what I think is pretty interesting about it is that it showed, for one, that you can acutely manipulate the type of fuel you're burning during exercise just by the pre-exercise meal, which I think was interesting, and we'll talk about what those meals were. But just to go over briefly what the study was, they recruited 30 experienced runners. They called them experienced runners.
Actually, before we even do that, before we get into the realms of it, why don't we just explain this whole substrate oxidation? Because I think this is the thing that a lot of people hear about. They see these words, substrate oxidation, and they're like, okay, and they sort of think about it. Why don't we explain what that means in the big picture of this? Because substrate oxidation, and if we want to even, can we call it metabolic flexibility? Is that where we sort of think about this? Because when I read the word substrate oxidation, okay, we're thinking carbs and fat. And it's always this okay, are you really good at burning fat, or are you really good at burning carbs? And does that ultimately make you a better athlete? Do you want to just dive into that whole substrate oxidation just before we get into the actual
study? Yeah, I think that would be important. Yeah, thanks for catching me on that. I think it'd be important to talk about that a little. So substrate oxidation, it just refers to the type of fuel that you're burning during exercise, and for exercise, that's going to be either fat or carbohydrates, minimal contribution of protein to energy expenditure, energy utilization during exercise. And so traditional exercise physiology would have that, say, at intensities around 65% or maybe a little bit below that of your VO2 max, most of your energy contribution is going to come from fat oxidation. It's at a low enough intensity that fat can be broken down at a rate that is sufficient to supply energy at those exercise intensities. And then above, say, 65%, you start to get an increasing contribution from carbohydrates to fuel utilization. And then traditionally, it was once thought, and I think still, myself and most people might still believe, that there's sort of this crossover point that occurs where, or maybe not a crossover point, but once you reach around 85% of VO2 max, all or most of your energy contribution is going to be coming from carbohydrates. And actually, the group that we're talking about now, they actually showed in one of their other recent studies that above 85% VO2 max, if you're on a ketogenic diet, you actually might have an extremely high contribution of fat to your energy production. But so the idea of metabolic flexibility that you noted, I think, refers to if you are exercising and, say, your glycogen stores maybe are running low or you're underfueled. Metabolic flexibility would refer to your ability to also exercise at a pretty high intensity while utilizing fat, or basically just utilize whatever fuel you have available. And I think the study today illustrates that, where if you eat something high fat, well, you're going to burn that fat during exercise. If you eat carbs, you're going to burn the carbs during exercise. Somebody metabolically flexible would be able to sort of switch between burning different fuels based on their availability, whereas somebody maybe metabolically inflexible, say if they were improperly fueled, didn't have enough carbohydrates, didn't have enough glycogen, they wouldn't necessarily be able to perform the same if they were, just say fueled on fat, or if they were running for a long amount of time and they weren't able to sufficiently burn fat at that exercise intensity. So I think there's a lot of, I wouldn't say confusion, but not necessarily a consensus on what the quote unquote metabolic flexibility means. You see it a lot in the health space. It's going to be metabolically flexible, but I think if you ask anybody, including me, to define it, I'm not sure what it would mean, but essentially it just means, and most athletes are probably flexible metabolically, but you're able to use what you have available to you in terms of fuels.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there's a couple of things I want to add to that is, you talked about that percentage of VO2 max. And I think, again, a lot of people go, oh, if you're under 65% of VO2 max, that you're only burning fat. And it's like, no, you're still using carbohydrates. That's first and foremost. And that contribution, that percentage of contribution of fat and carbohydrates does shift and change, as you said. But it's not like your body has this switch. It doesn't go, ooh, okay, fat only now, carbohydrates later. It's like this graded contribution. And I think what you're getting at in this whole concept of metabolic flexibility, certainly in athletes, is that maybe you can increase the amount of fat you use even as the amount of effort or the relative intensity or absolute intensity goes up. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing I think is that concept of metabolic flexibility. And I think this is always lost as well. I see this all the time in social media, especially Instagram. There is a difference between being sedentary and metabolically flexible versus like that athletic performance. And what does that mean? I think absolutely for the lay person, you want that metabolic flexibility, that you're not just running on sugars and that on a daily basis, that you have the ability to utilize fat as a fuel source at rest. But I think what we're getting at with athletes is this notion, and I think historically, especially for endurance athletes, you need to be an optimal fat burner to perform really well, especially for endurance events like a 70.3 Ironman or ultra endurance, even marathons. And I guess what we're now seeing is maybe you don't have to be that good at burning fat in order to perform. And I guess what this study showed, certainly for short distances, it doesn't make a difference. So that concept of, you need to be a super fat burner in order to perform, definitely doesn't hold true with the 5 kilometer and 10 kilometer time trial. And I think what this study showed me was that if you do go the high fat versus maybe a suboptimal carb, you probably will just produce the same results, which for me is sort of like a null event, I guess, in that sense.
Right. And not only, I think, is in some instances maybe not an advantage to be a better fat burner or train yourself to be a better fat burner for exercise. I think there's some literature, by Louise Burke and her colleagues, that it might actually be detrimental to performance if you become a better fat burner. They did, the supernova studies where they studied the race walkers, and they had them do time trials after 4 to 6 weeks, I think, on a ketogenic diet. They were incredible at burning fat. They like doubled their fat burning capacity, but that came at the expense of their glycolytic capacity. They became worse at burning carbs, and they performed worse in their time trials. So, and I think in general, when we're talking about this stuff, it's also important, as you mentioned, to differentiate between sedentary general folks training and athletes who, most athletes are probably good carb burners. I mean, I won't say that or fat burners across the board. I won't say that, universally, but if you just look at, athletes who aren't specifically training to be fat burners, they probably still have a high capacity to burn fat, because unless you are on top of your fueling for every single training session, there are a lot of training sessions that you're, just burning fat and building up that metabolic machinery.
Well, absolutely. That it's the glycogen threshold sort of hypothesis, isn't it? Like the chances of you completely replenishing whatever you were burning are probably pretty low. So if you train enough and you train consistently, you're improving your ability to use fat as a fuel source anyway. And like, you're doing it inadvertently. And I think people forget that all the time. So to your point, like we look at the studies where it shows like if you're a trained, and I put inverted commas, a trained endurance athlete, you will be a better fat burner than a sedentary individual. It just happens. Like, so I think everyone gets so like worked up about it, but it's like maybe it doesn't matter. I think what you brought up about the long-term sort of effects of sort of the high-fat diet, I think that is important as well in relation to this study. And the authors do note that this is showing acute substrate sort of manipulation through an acute diet. And I think there was another study that I highlighted to you, which was in the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science in Sports, which was titled, again, Divergent Changes in Peak Fat Oxidation and Fat Max following 3-day dietary interventions are related to muscle glycogen availability in men. It's exactly the same thing. They put people either on high fat or low carb, high fat or high carb, and they showed that those on the acute high fat diet had increased peak fat oxidation levels. So we know in that you can change that. And in the acute setting, maybe it doesn't interfere with carbohydrate oxidation rates, which again, this study showed that we're going to discuss. However, in the chronic setting, maybe it has, if you directly try and manipulate it by going really high fat, it might have the impact or the negative impact on the ability to utilize carbohydrates when you need them most, when you're going hard. So yeah, I think it is always something like, again, what gets lost, isn't it? People will, I can see it now, like this study, like there's no difference between fat and carbs for 5 and 10K time trial. And it's like, yeah, but it was acute. What happens in the chronic? I'd love to see this now being maybe replicated. And there are some studies where, you know, chronic adaptation to a high fat diet, maybe for 5K, 10K, but then let's do half marathon, let's do marathon. And interestingly, the group that I was involved with their ketogenic study, they just finished because it was based on the Sydney Marathon, and their results will come out. And from my understanding, pretty much everyone PR'd, whether they're on high fat or the high carbohydrate diets. It's just how much improvement was seen for both groups. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. So
yeah, definitely. But certainly the overall dietary context matters. And yeah, what I think we'll see with this study today is, yes, the acute dietary manipulation doesn't matter in the context of what these guys were eating. They called it a standard American diet. So they were just eating a generally high carb diet during their regular life and only manipulated what they ate a couple hours before the time trial. So
yeah. So why don't we get into that? So who was involved in the study? As in which participants?
They recruited, it was recreational runners. Oh, you mean the authors or the participants?
No. The participants.
Yep. So recreational runners, VO2 max was around mid 40s. They reported running about 10 to 30 miles of running per week. So, 5 to, 20 kilometers, maybe something like that. 10 to 20 kilometers. And, so they call them recreational runners, not a super high training volume, not trained athletes. I think their average 5K times were 23, 24 minutes. Average 10K times were around 43, 44 minutes or something like that. So these are kind of the participants, and I think that's an important thing to note as well of who these participants were. So they weren't elite athletes. I wouldn't even consider them well-trained. I would really just consider them kind of like recreationally athletic in terms of their categorization.
Definitely. And they were males only. I think that is important to note for this. So whilst we would love to see more or talk more about how this applies to females, I think in this case, just let's keep this in mind that they were males only that were studied in this case.
Yeah, important to note, as a lot of these initial studies usually are for some reason, despite the push in physiology research to kind of correct that. So yeah, and then maybe we want to move on to sort of what they did for the study, what the design looked like. Yeah. So they split them into two groups. So there were 15 or 30 runners total, but they only did 15 per group. So one group was kind of assigned to run 5K for a time trial. One group was assigned to run 10K. So 15 participants per group. But they did two different dietary manipulations before them. So either 5K or 10K group. One group, before one of the 5Ks, they ate a high carb. They would say low fat. It wasn't really low fat. It did contain some fat, but a high carb meal. Second meal, they ate a high fat or a low carb meal. And these, a meal might be stretching it a bit. It wasn't really a meal. They kind of ate these nutrition bars. So in the low carb one, they ate something called a keto brick. So I got the energy breakdown right here. It was 1,000 calories of each. 90 grams of fat in the low carb meal, 62 grams of saturated fat, and then it had 30 grams of protein, 12 grams of carbs. So very negligible carbs there. High carb meal, it was 46 grams of fat, so about half the amount of fat compared to the low carb meal, 127 carbs, and 17 grams of protein. And they ate those 3 hours before they performed the time trial. So they waited 3 hours, and then they performed either 5K time trial or 10K time trial.
So my comments on that would be, firstly, again, I know they have to get the funding from somewhere, but the keto brick was one of the funding partners of the study, which, people might say has an influence. Yeah, whatever. They've got to get it from somewhere. It's just important to note. I think the other thing that I noted was that you pointed out the high carb, low fat meal still had 46 grams of fat, which I would put in the high fat category, and certainly at Fuel In we would too. We would not recommend that before a session. I think the most we would probably recommend is 10 to 15 grams of fat, and the amount of carbohydrates based on the average weight of the individual, I think it was around 78, 80 kilos, puts that pre-meal at around 1.5 grams per kilo, which we again at Fuel In would say that's probably a bit low if we were actually trying to get them to take in, even from a dietetics standpoint or nutrition standpoint, I would like to see sort of 2 grams, 2 to 2.5 grams. And that sort of would play in line, that recent study where they investigated the effect of timing of intra-session fueling, either every 15 minutes or every 30 minutes, and looking at the impact of that. That sort of lines up with that type of meal pre-session. So I think it could have been better in terms of lower fat and higher carbs for the high carb group to give a really clear distinction. That probably would have been my only criticism of those meals. Maybe it would have had an impact. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe
not, but it does seem like you would want to make them almost as drastically different as possible, and that would have resulted in just maybe nixing all the fat from that meal completely, just saying maybe 200 grams of carb.
Yeah, I would have liked to have seen the protein equated as well. The high carb group had, I don't have a problem with them taking in 25 or 30 grams of protein, but they had literally 50% of the protein as well. Now, I'm not saying that would have had an impact on performance, but I would have liked to have just seen that equated, and then really the distinction being between the carbohydrates and the fats, just to keep it level. So anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think, given the fact that it had maybe twice as much protein, would you expect that to influence it at all, or maybe just a nuance that you would have liked them maybe to take care of? They did note that it was the participants felt fuller after the high fat meal, which I don't know like how important that is, but of course, it had more fat and more protein. I would expect that.
Yeah, I read that from the authors as well, that they was like, the low carb high fat meal was more satiating, and we were surprised by this. And I was like, what are you surprised about? Like, typically fat will be, typically fat, I would say, is very satiating. And certainly with a double the amount of protein, that's exactly why you use protein, especially when you're trying to get athletes to lose body weight or body fat by keeping them full. You use protein or you use fiber. So, one or the other. So, yeah, and I don't think it's a positive to feel really satiated or full before going and doing a 5 and 10K run.
I was thinking the same thing as well. I know everybody's different, but I I won't mind feeling a little bit hungry going into a race. I don't want to be underfueled, but I don't really want to feel, like I got a brick in my stomach. I kind of want to have a little bit, I got some fuel on board, but I'm a little hungry. I feel light, I don't feel weighed down. So I didn't necessarily see that as a positive either, but.
Yeah, I certainly read it as a negative, although it was sort of portrayed as a positive. But yeah, for us, I think what we certainly, with our athletes on Fuel In, we'd be, trying to get them to take in large amounts of carbs, but obviously by using, minimal fiber intake, hopefully they can get in very large amounts of carbs and actually still feel pretty good and pretty light on their feet. And I think manipulating, again, what we're playing around with at the moment is actually bringing that amount of protein and certainly the amount of fat down. So well below that sort of 2 to 3 grams per kilo, which we'd typically recommend. We're bringing that down now to around 1.5, 1.6 grams, which, if you're a lighter athlete, some of them, even the moderate, 70, 80 kilo athletes are like, wow, I haven't eaten that little protein for a long time. They reduce the protein. They don't necessarily feel, and I'm definitely not worried about anything going wrong in, again, an acute setting, even if you took in 1 or 1.2 grams per kilo for that day. If that allows you to get more of the carbs in and still feel light on your feet, I think that's certainly an advantage. That's certainly how we're seeing it at Fuel In.
Yeah, I would agree too. Perception often is, very important in terms of you want to have a comfortable stomach while you're exercising. I mean, gastrointestinal things can make or break a performance as well. So you have to kind of find that balance between this is going to fuel me, but it's also going to taste good and sit well in my stomach and not make me barf.
Yeah, no, completely. Okay, let's. So that was pre-exercise meal. That was the study design. And what do we see?
Yeah, well, kind of what you would expect. Well, maybe not what you would expect. I mean, this is kind of one of maybe the first-ish studies like this, looking at the acute metabolic changes. So, but the high carb or the low carb meal, the high fat meal, basically it was 77% higher fat oxidation during the 5K and about 58% higher during the 10K. So maybe that doesn't mean much. So we can look at it in terms of grams per minute. So they were burning about 0.7 grams a minute during the 5K after the low carb and 0.37 grams per minute after the high carb meal, and that was for the 5K, and then 10K 0.7 versus 0.44 grams per minute. And that kind of stood out to me. I mean, it doubled fat oxidation, but what stood out to me there was still fairly relatively low rates of fat oxidation, I feel like. I mean, I don't know what standard numbers are, but I mean, some of these lower carb studies have noted, 1.2 to 1.4 grams per minute, but maybe that's in keto adapted athletes, but that just seemed like a pretty low fat oxidation rate to me. Again, they weren't necessarily... What
was their number?
0.68 and then 0.7 grams per minute in 5K, 10K.
Yeah, look, it's certainly not on the super high side, as you said. With the chronically adapted, you'll get well over 1 gram. Then you look at the carbohydrate, like those who take in a very high carbohydrate sort of intake, they could have low levels of 0.3. So it's not super high, but it's not super low. But I guess the point being is it didn't really influence anything anyway.
Yeah, right. And so we can maybe go ahead and talk about that. Just looking at the carb oxidation, though. So lower during the 10K with the low carb. So 1 gram per minute versus 2.6 grams per minute after the high carb. And then, interestingly, carb oxidation during the 5K, it wasn't any different. So fat oxidation increased in both of them. Carb oxidation was only higher in the 10K with the high carb meal versus the low carb meal. And then not any different during the 5K. You saw changes in RER. Obviously, 4 to 5% basically lower during the low carb conditions, and then higher ketones during it, but they weren't necessarily even ketogenic during it. I think I don't have the numbers right here, but based on the graph, it's like they were at 0.2, 0.3 millimolar, which is even below the ketosis range during that. And so maybe not totally surprising just to see those numbers, because as we said, these aren't particularly well-trained athletes. They weren't, these elite athletes who you might see maybe their ketones are up, maybe their fat oxidation rates are higher. So kind of the metabolic changes you would expect basically based on these high carb and low carb meals.
Yeah. I guess the big take home from this was, despite the changes in substrate oxidation, I think the most important thing is that practically the times, as they said, statistically didn't matter. However, when you actually look into the results, and we, did look into the results, I would say over that 5K and 10K distance, the times did actually support the high carb group in terms of, what was it? Approximately 73% of the participants ran faster, 5K and 10K time trial races, compared to 27% who responded better on the low carb, high fat meal. So whilst statistically not significant, when you look at the plot for the differences in the number of athletes involved, I mean, it clearly favored the high carb group, low fat
Yeah,
group.
and even if you look at the figure from that study, it doesn't even take any quantitative data to see. You can basically just glance at it and say, oh, well, more people ran better after the high carb compared to the low carb. And as you mentioned, the times for both of them weren't statistically significant in terms of how they performed. So after the low carb, they ran 23 minutes and 18 seconds for the 5K. And then after the high carb, after the low carb, it was 23 minutes and 6 seconds. So a 12-second difference in performance, slightly better numerically for the high carb, 12 seconds faster. Okay, we can argue for days over whether that means anything, but as you and I were talking about offline, yeah, okay, I'll take 12 seconds of my 5K with a single meal. And then for 10K, again, not statistically significant, but with the low carb meal, 44 minutes, 24 seconds, and then 43 minutes and 30 seconds with high carb. So it's nearly a minute. That's 56 seconds faster with the high carb meal. And so again, practically, okay, any runner is going to be happy with a 1 minute difference between just based on what I eat 3 hours before that race. And so statistics argue over it, p-values, okay, whatever. But practically for me, yeah, that's a minute, and that means something.
I think that's the big thing about this study. There was a couple of things that I kept thinking about. Okay, a minute in a 10K. I mean, the shorter the distance, the more significant the time matters. As you said, a minute in a half marathon or a marathon, it still probably matters, but maybe not nearly as much as in a 10K or a 5K. A minute could place you, 10 or 15 places higher. Especially with how tight things are getting. And certainly even 30 seconds in a 5K time trial or 20 seconds is going to be a significant difference. And, so I think those times, whilst they were hidden statistically, I think are significant in terms of the practical outcomes. I think the other thing is this study talked about race fueling, yet they investigated a 5 and a 10K distance. And the authors specifically note that they didn't want to investigate exercise-induced hypoglycemia. And so I'm like, why not? Isn't that the point of this? Does being better fat adapted actually reduce the likelihood of that EIH, that exercise-induced hypoglycemia? And I know that they did talk about their previous study, which I know Dr. Alan McCubbin and I discussed. I think we might have even discussed at some point. But, and I just want to quote from this study what they said. They said, while controlling for diet, i.e. mixed diet, our most recent work suggests that neither glycogen nor carbohydrate oxidation determines prolonged strenuous exercise bout performance, and that minimal carbohydrate dosing, i.e. 10 grams an hour, improves exercise performance through mitigating exercise-induced hypoglycemia. And my issue with this is that's not actually what that study showed. That study showed that suboptimal performance will occur for the carbohydrate group because they didn't actually take in enough carbs. And that was in line with the high-fat group, who also had a pretty suboptimal performance. So it's high fat was not superior to low carb. It was I would have liked to have seen high carb versus low fat. High carb versus high fat in order to see actually was there a true difference. I think what that study showed is that if you go high fat and you have suboptimal carbohydrate intake, you'll perform, you just won't perform that well. And I think that's sort of like this study. It's like, cool, you can eat some fat beforehand and maybe mess up your carbohydrate meal. You may not perform that badly. You just may not perform that well. And so I'd really like to see, again, like you said, that real distinction between fat and carbohydrates and really break it out a little bit more in that, and probably see the distances go up so that we can truly determine it.
I think that's a really good point about the distances, but as well as the, what kind of conclusions that we can make from the study. Because you're right. I mean, what it shows us, similar to the other study that you referenced, in where they did the 10 grams per hour. Okay, what I would have liked to see is a 40, 50, 60, maybe even 90 gram per hour condition. Like, let's compare, you're comparing suboptimal to suboptimal, and maybe that's what happened even in this study. Maybe we were comparing suboptimal to suboptimal. Maybe if we have a third condition in this study that we're talking about today where they have either more carbohydrates or we change the timing of the meal, like maybe these people were performing worse on both of the conditions compared to what they were if they were quote unquote adequately fueled. We don't really know that. So with just two conditions, there's only a certain, length that we can go to, what conclusions we can make are very limited.
Yeah, I think this may come back to what we discussed around the authors is like, I think inherently there's just that little bit of bias. Mm-hmm. And so there may be like going, okay, we want to investigate the high fat, but we don't want to make the carb group really optimal. We just want to show that maybe it makes a difference or not. And it's like, back to that 10 grams an hour study. Who does that? I mean, I don't think you could find, unless they were a full keto advocate, low carb, I would struggle to believe that anyone currently racing, 5 and 10K. I mean, at Fuel In, we'd recommend maybe an optional gel in the 10K. 5K, we're not going to recommend any fueling. So let's take it to a half marathon, 70.3 Ironman. No one in their right mind is taking 10 grams an hour for any of those races. So, like, let's make what is happening in the practical world, like, let's investigate that. That's what I would love to see. And, hopefully the authors do recognize that and acknowledge that and go, yeah, okay, we pretty much saw suboptimal performances based on the study design, not necessarily the design, but the intervention. Let's change the intervention, similar study, maybe increase the distance and see what happens.
Yeah, I do think that there's a little bit of we're going to design this, maybe not with a malicious intent, but okay, we kind of know going into this what the result is going to be based on how we designed the study. And something too that I think is important to note is like, they can make conclusions, I think, which is fine about what this study showed and what it didn't, but let's like limit it to who we can actually apply this to. And I think for this study, the application is limited to runners of this caliber, of this training volume, and of this level of fitness. Because I think if we're trying to say this applies to elite athletes who are racing even 5K, 10K, don't even extend the distance. Because I don't think I included this in my write-up of the study, but I was doing some calculations just based on what their VO2 max was based on their preliminary testing, and then what their VO2 or their oxygen uptake was during these time trials. And I don't even think they reached 70% of their maximum intensity during these 5K and 10K time trials. So is this even a 10K or 5K race? I mean, this isn't even a race setting. This is moderate intensity exercise. And so for me, that really limits even what we can conclude about intensity. I mean, most runners are going to be racing a 5K or a 10K. They're going to be 85 to 90% or more of their VO2 max, not 70%. I don't expect to see a difference. I don't think fueling is going to make a difference at 70% of VO2 max, especially less than an hour. So
yeah, and intensity, coming back to how you described, that substrate oxidation, intensity becomes a big factor in this. Like how well you use carbohydrates or fat and what your body chooses to use is going to be intensity based. Now, yes, you may be able to change that and use higher amounts of fat at that higher intensity, but I think you've got to test that as well, don't you? Like in the acute setting, did having the high fat, if they went to the intensity where we expect carbohydrates to be really used, how would that high fat group have performed? And I think, as you say, it wasn't the case in this study.
My main conclusions from, I think, this study are, it was an interesting study, and I even said this in my write-up, like, commend the authors for doing it. I think we did learn a lot, especially the acute manipulation of substrate oxidation, as you and I were chatting about. But unfortunately, I do think that they're a little bit too strong in their conclusions about what this means for the equivalency, I guess is what I would like to say, of low carb and high carb. I think that what they want to do is too quickly jump to the conclusion that, oh, well, this means that it doesn't matter, what you eat, you can perform the same with high carb and low carb. And yes, that's what the study showed, but in this specific context. And I don't think that we should go much further than extrapolating this to what it means for marathon, half marathon, Ironman, anything longer than a 5K or 10K in these recreationally trained athletes.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, people could say, well, you're not slamming them. I think whether criticizing them or whatever we're doing, critiquing them, that they're high fat, keto bias, and people could say, well, Scott, you're carb biased. And yeah, I'd agree. I probably am carb biased. I look at the results on this and say, yeah, if you do suboptimal carbohydrate intake and maybe preparation and compare that to high fat, you'll probably have mediocre results for a 5 and a 10K race. What I would like to see is, even for the 5 and 10K, let's really distinguish it, high carb, low fat, and equate that and get that right going in. But then I think it's the longer distances. Let's really, and look, I don't think it's unequivocal yet as to what is best. I think it's definitely leaning towards carbohydrates are best. The amount of carbohydrates, I think that's going to be the really interesting point as we move forward. Now, we're hearing rates of, 100. We had Dr. Andy Sparks on from Morton, and he was saying, like, some of the Tour de France riders are riding 200 grams per hour, but we're talking elite athletes who probably have an incredible ability to utilize carbohydrates, that exogenous carbohydrate, that intake of carbohydrates. So at the same time, probably have off the charts fat oxidation levels as well because of the amount of training they're doing. But then on the other hand, I have heard stories about Tom Evans. He just won UTMB, and that he was struggling with 120 grams of carbs per hour and feeling really sick. They then assess his exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rate, and it's actually not that great. But then they look at his fat oxidation, and apparently it's off the charts. So that then starts to make sense. Well, he still used a lot of carbohydrates. He didn't go 10 grams an hour to win UTMB. My understanding is, and again, I don't work with Tom, but my understanding just through the grapevine is he dropped down to around 90 grams an hour, which is high carb, probably not as high as you'd expect for someone doing UTMB, likely used other food sources or fuel sources, maybe some fats, to actually continue the total calorie or energy intake, and certainly performed at his best. So I think where I'm coming with this is that amount of carbohydrates, that high carbohydrate intake, I think that's the individualization that will occur and that athletes need to be thinking about. And that's certainly what we talk about within Fuel In. Let's test, and practically not everyone has access to these isotopes that they can get assessed, although there are kits apparently being made now in companies in the UK where you can do this. But, at the basic level, look at what either your run threshold pace is, look at, power on the bike, super high power, fast running. Okay, you're probably going to need more carbs, and then start to take them in. Log what you're doing, document how many products you're taking in, equate what that is as grams per hour. Now, obviously, we do all those calculations directly in Fuel In, but even on a spreadsheet, you can do this, and you can start to see, I feel really good on 60 grams an hour. I feel great on 70 grams an hour, 80 grams an hour, amazing. 90, I start to feel a little bit sick. oh, maybe I'm only running at 4-minute 30, 4-minute 30 Ks. Okay, maybe I don't need more than 70 grams an hour. Or you're running a 220 marathon and maybe you feel great on 100 grams an hour. Like, I think it is that specificity that an individual needs to work out, or at least, get some help with understanding what those amounts would be for them.
I think so too, and I think you can get as technical with the approach as you want, like you said, creating spreadsheets. But I think subjective, how you feel, what you can tolerate, is probably a good indicator as well. Like you said, okay, well, I'm going to go out for my long run this week and I'm going to try 70. If I feel good, no GI distress, maybe next week I'm going to bump it up. So sort of titrate up those doses to, base it on intensity, and just customize it, I think I think the problem with the whole, high carb mania these days is good, because I think athletes are fueling and pushing the limits of fueling, but there's also a bit of like a fear of missing out among some athletes who think that they also need to try 100 or 110 grams per hour or 140 like David Roach during Western States, when in fact that might not be at all, what you need. So, fuel to fit your own individual work requirements. We're all so different, and if you can get a metabolic test or something fancy, great, do that. But otherwise, just experiment, test, and kind of tinker around to find out what works for you, I think.
Yeah. Use Fuel In because it makes it easy. You can just enter the numbers. But I think on a serious note, though, what you said there, David Roche, top of the top, he's taking in that amount. Like, ask yourself, are you running the same pace as him? Probably not. So you probably don't need that amount. And I think that is really important. The other point I would say, you said where you go out and maybe you do 70 grams an hour. Maybe you feel great. Maybe you don't feel great. I would also urge athletes, if they do get to 70 grams an hour and not feel great, repeat it. Repeat it again the next time and see. And then they do it again and they're like, actually 70 grams wasn't that bad. And then they do it again and then it's suddenly 70 grams is actually really easy. So I think a common mistake with athletes is that they might go higher amounts of carbohydrates. They do it once, they feel a little bit sick and they're like, ooh, I'm not going to go back there. And I think the analogy is it's a bit like, doing bench press or squats. If you never went back because it hurt the first time you did it, you'd never get better at it.
I agree. There's so many variables that from one run to the next are going to affect how you feel. I've had plenty of runs, this summer where I'm using the identical fueling strategy and maybe you need a bathroom break on one and not on the other. It probably depends more on what you ate the night before versus how you're fueling during the run. And temperature matters. How fast are you running? Are you hydrating well? All those things matter. So I agree. Give yourself 2-3 trials maybe with the same fueling strategy before you totally rule something out. I think too, something that matters a lot is like, what is the types of fuel you're using. There are so many options available these days in terms of the gels, the composition of the gels, the composition of the carbohydrate mixes that you're taking. Finding out what ratio of glucose to fructose to maltodextrin, it's like all these variables could play into that. Some people might like, I respond very well, or I handle maltodextrin very well. So I use these maltodextrin gels a lot because they just sit well in my stomach, where other runners might like glucose. Some runners just take like honey and maple syrup, which I don't really find to work that well for me. So, I think what you eat matters as much as like how much in terms of carbs as well.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I think a lot of people forget that you might be able to just consume maltodextrin or glucose even up to 80 grams an hour. And yeah, if you're certainly in that 40 to 60 grams an hour sort of category, which is a lot of athletes, maybe choose a gel. Have a look at the gel composition, because it could be the thing that really is dragging you down. And as you say, maybe just a straight maltodextrin or glucose gel could be the best thing for you, as opposed to these, multiple sort of carbohydrate formulations.
Yeah, for sure. I haven't quite pushed the 90 to 100 grams per hour yet. Most of it, I think at Boston this year I was around 80, grams per hour for gels. So I'm trying to maybe bump that up a little bit, but I think I performed pretty well on like that. Most of the time I'm like 60 per hour during training, and I try to bump it up a little bit during racing, but I'm racing fine, but who knows how much faster I might be able to go
So that's where I would
push those limits.
Yeah, I'd love to see you probably push it up in training, get up into the 90, maybe the 100 grams in training, see how you're performing. And you can always drop it down in the race. But potentially, if you fuel your training better, does that then result in better adaptation or the ability, as you say, to push harder and things like that? And does that end up making your race go, potentially 2 minutes faster, which again, when you're down at up at your level, I think, all those minutes are going to count, aren't they?
Yeah. I think, maybe doing a once weekly or a couple sessions this block where I'm doing 100 grams per hour could probably be beneficial. Sorry. Good night, Lee.
Got the kitties. That's good.
Yeah, he came down to say good night. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Real world. That's what we live in, isn't it? Mate, as always, pleasure. Love talking the science with you. You've always got some great insights. Keep doing the newsletter. For anyone who doesn't sign up for the newsletter, I definitely recommend doing so. Do you want to give it a plug just quickly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's Physiologically Speaking, and I write that on Substack. But if you just go to physiologicallyspeaking.com, that's kind of the domain where I host it at. You can sign up there. It's free. So the weekly newsletter is free. I'll post some paid content sometimes that's like specific, but yeah, it's all free and something new every week. I think there's more science coming out than I can actually cover, which is unfortunate because I would like to write about these. I could probably write about a new study every day, but this stuff is fun, and that's why I'm thankful that you keep inviting me on, because we get to talk about maybe some of the studies that I'm not able to cover, or some of the more important stuff that I think deserves a little more airtime.
That's perfect, mate. And I appreciate your time, and keep doing what you're doing. I think deciphering and delving into the science and trying to explain to everyone, the elite athlete to the age grouper, about what is real and what is maybe not so real is super important in this day and age. So, mate, until next time, I'll catch you later.
Thanks a lot, Scott.